seats. Also, I want to make a note that when we get to the Q&A section, if you raise your hand, they'll run a microphone to you so everyone can hear you.
Yeah, just wait for that mic.
Yeah. Then you get to be on a hot mic. That's always fun.
Right. You're
All
part
right.
of the record.
Come on in, everybody. Come on and take a seat. It's Eric time.
And Eric has a presentation entitled, it's a bit clickbaity, Banks Without Bankers. But
I like it.
The real question is, what is a banker? We'll let Eric tell you.
All right. Let's give Eric a round of applause.
Yes, please. Yeah, just up here. Thanks, guys. Hello. Who here likes banks? Okay, we got one guy who likes banks in the back. All right. No, it's a good mindset. There's a lot of valuable things that banks have done for financial systems over the years. And just out of curiosity to help me in this conversation, who here is a developer? Raise your hand. Okay, and then anybody here work in the financial or, economics? Okay, and a lot of people just love Bitcoin, right? No shout out? All right, let's jump into it. Here's a QR code with a bunch of links to what I'm talking about today. It's based on this research that just dropped yesterday on Alan Farrington's website. So this whole idea is that I've been working on this research for about a year, and for those of you that know me, you might know that I wrote the book, The Seventh Property. That was kind of how I started into Bitcoin, and a lot of it's a summary of monetary history as well as banking history. And as I get deeper, I think that there's this very large question that has a massive implication for Bitcoin of the underlying price of Bitcoin is going to be massively affected in the long term by how this financial system around it scales, as well as not just that, but how it's enabling freedom throughout the world. I think that this is kind of like the biggest question is, how is Bitcoin going to scale? How is it going to be custodied in the long run? Who's going to be using it for payments? And I've been kind of working on long-form research, digging into some of these questions, covering the theoretical side of economics, as well as at a protocol level, trying to bridge the gap for developers and technologists and showing them from an economics perspective what this could look like. So some of you might have seen this. It's probably too small, but this is a quote from Hal Finney, where he believed that Bitcoin would scale with a system of free banks over time. And this was largely before we've seen some of the protocols and technologies that we're familiar with today, like the Lightning Network. But there's a lot of wisdom in what he's trying to describe here. And my goal in a lot of my research is to understand that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater when we're trying to figure out what functions of a financial system are valuable and then what need to be removed. So it all kind of starts with the agency problem, and the agency problem is defined as where there's a conflict of interest between a principal and an agent. The agent will act in their self-interest, and that's going to bring about some form of moral hazard or bad things. And I think an easy way to conceptualize that is that if you were to hire a courier to deliver $1 million for you versus $1 million worth of apples, when it comes to money, money is a very saleable good. So this is a concept I kind of defined in my book, that because it's the most saleable good in society, it's more subject to the agency problem than anything else. And when you hire this courier, it's going to be much harder for them to steal those apples and go sell that. Whereas if they have $1 million cash, it's going to be very easy for them to just take that money and go spend it. So that's why financial history is littered with fraud. That's why we have governments attempting to politically capture money. It's the most valuable, most saleable good. And it's more subject to agency than anything else. So Bitcoin solved this for base layer settlement money. And that's a massive thing, right? I think that the incentives of what we've created here has pretty much removed the long-term probability that central banking will persist and fiat money will persist. But that doesn't mean that other functions like fractional reserve banking we're certain are going to go away yet. And depending on how the system scales and how the peer-to-peer network ultimately builds out, or the more custodial it is going to affect that. So, how did Bitcoin solve this? It solved it through technology, and it solved it through incentive alignment. Technology, this is a quote from the white paper. We define an electronic coin as a chain of digital signatures, right? That was using cryptography to create, this token of economic value. And it also used incentive alignment. Here's a quote kind of related to the Satoshi on how 51% attacks are going to be protected against. And he says, he ought to find it more profitable to play by the rules, such rules that favor him with more new coins than everyone else combined, than to undermine the system and the validity of his own wealth. And like, that's a very beautiful thing, right? Satoshi used incentives and aligned them in a way so that we didn't have to create some complex technological solution for certain functions. The network would naturally find the outcomes that we desire. And that's a very hard thing to accomplish. And much of the beauty and elegance of Bitcoin is kind of within incentive alignment. So Bitcoin didn't solve the agency problem for everything. And like, that's fundamentally what's happening here is now we look up to other layers of the financial system. When we look in how is it going to be custodied? How are payments going to exist? We have some level of agency that exists in a significant way today. We're building technologies to remove it from tomorrow. And there's a natural level that I think it's ultimately going to find. And I think it's based around this idea that like, agency doesn't need to be eliminated, it needs to be optimized for, because agency is this fundamental economic function, right? Until we can solve for the process of specialization and the division of labor, what's brought about the wealth of the past few centuries that we have today, until we can create wealth without doing that, we're going to have agency in all these different functions. So we need to optimize it where we can. There's a lot of unnecessary agency that exists in our financial system today with political leaders being involved and financial intermediaries having regulatory barriers set up. It's similar to malinvestment, right? You can kind of think about it in that type of terminology. It's just that we have this pervasive amount of agency. We're reducing that within this system. So you want to think about this question, I think, from a development perspective of like, a lot of people think that just because we have a technological solution to something that reduces agency, that's good. Well, it depends on if the incentives are aligned, right? You don't want to think, can this be done without agents? You want to think, will this be demanded without agents involved in the process? And that's what we're looking at, is that cryptography is this tool we're using to optimize for agency. We did it in Bitcoin, and now we're applying it to other financial functions and settlement layers. So this is a quote from the research that like by applying cryptographic solutions to fundamental financial functions, agency can be reduced throughout the financial system. Emerging technologies that are native to the Bitcoin ecosystem continue to express novel cryptographic innovations. So that's a long-winded way of saying that, we're creating innovation through things like the Lightning Network. And there's emergent protocols as well, like Fediment or Cashew, or theorized protocols like ARC. And all of this is this natural emergence of this native financial system using cryptography as a tool to reduce agency. So I'm going to summarize a few high-level takeaways. Much of this is complex. I encourage you to go to the research. I can't explain all of it. But agency optimization, I think, is really going to change the way that we organize. And something that I think we're just scratching the surface on the potential of multi-signature transactions. Those have created a way for us to democratize shared custody. And that's an incredibly valuable thing. We don't need to have unilateral custodial control over things anymore. And it doesn't also mean that we need to have unilateral control from a self-custodial perspective. We can create very secure methods of ownership of assets in a shared format where perhaps one party has majority control or everybody has equal control. And when you apply that to the way that humans have organized throughout history, where typically when we look to entrust people with assets, we optimize for that trust, right? That's kind of based around some sort of genetic or geographic alignment, people in our local communities, people that are familiar with us. And we trust them with certain things. I've trusted my family with my financial wealth for the vast majority of my life. And now with the advent of the internet and new forms of organization that are emerging online, we can optimize for trust using shared asset ownership in very novel and different ways. And I think that it's kind of like this network state idea emerging a bit. We don't really know the potential of these forms of organization yet or what economies are going to emerge from it. I think another thing that's very interesting is that we're starting to witness digitally native means of payment emerging. So I think that there's a bit of a debate between, is Lightning the same thing as Bitcoin? And it has fundamentally different properties, right? In order to operate on the Lightning Network, if you want to run a node, you have to have a hot wallet set up. That's very different from self-custodial Bitcoin. It has different risk. Does that mean it's a separate medium of exchange? And I think that I started off thinking that direction on this topic, but I think the more you delve into it, it's more like a separate means of payment is the idea. And yeah, I see some nods from this guy. I know he's excited about that. But it's more like a separate means of payment where, similar to our in our current system, like Lightning, eCash on Fedimint, or VTXOs with ARC, these are like, they're similar to like wires, cash, or cashier's checks that are emerging. They're functions that are being optimized through different protocols within the economic system, depending on how we want to be using Bitcoin and for what reason. So what I think is one of the most compelling aspects about this is we have Bitcoin at the base layer, we have these new protocols that are emerging on top of it, and those are leveraging Bitcoin for different economic functions like what we're discussing. But what's pretty novel to this system is that we have new financial markets kind of building around that. When you think about Lightning and you think about the ability to earn routing fees from your Lightning node, or the ability to lease liquidity that you maintain on a Lightning node, it's all aligned with this idea that we have a digitally native term structure of interest rates emerging. And similar to in our financial system, we have a term structure of interest rates for the bond markets, where short-term bonds are at the bottom. They're called, quote unquote, the risk-free rate, which we all know is complete bullshit. Everything has risk. And cold storage Bitcoin has risk. It has technological risk. You could lose your keys. There's things that could happen. You can mitigate that too. But that would kind of be at the bottom of this digitally native term structure. And then we'd have things like Lightning Network routing fees, where you just take on hot wallet risk and you earn a rate of return for that. And then you can build that up to liquidity leasing, where you don't necessarily have credit risk, but you have a risk that your Bitcoin might be locked up for a period of time longer than you'd expect. And you can earn a further rate of return. So we have this spectrum of risk and returns that you can earn. And that's creating these native capital markets, which haven't really existed before. And what's very interesting about these capital markets is the disintermediation that exists within them, and how the value that can be created from the issuance of, the base layer, where in our traditional system we have bonds and most of the value is being extracted by the government or financial intermediaries when these are issued. Now we have that existing in a peer-to-peer format, where the base layer is actually just providing, value back to the individuals who want to be supporting it. So that's that's really cool. And like a quote from the research is that Bitcoin native money markets are emerging alongside its enabling protocols. Over time, these markets will attract investment and create this virtuous cycle of adoption, where people will want to provide liquidity because they're earning this rate of return, and then people will want to participate and use it because of the functionality that's gained through that. And it's a very virtuous cycle. Everything stems from, are we using Bitcoin for payments in these functions? Are we using eCash for privacy in some functions, et cetera? And so that's something where I think, like, I'll skip over those details because these guys told me I got to cut it short. But eCash market making, I think, will be another aspect of this term structure of interest rates. Here's the link again, if that got you pretty excited. It's a pretty long paper, so it's like, I think 13,000 words or something. But I really encourage everybody to dig into this question. I think that I'm trying to be preemptive about some of these topics so that in the long run, we're walking into some of these problems having thought through a lot of the fundamental ideas. And I'll pull this up one more time at the end of the presentation. 3, 2, 1. Get in the back. Steve's almost got it. All right. But there's a lot of risk with this system. And so I'm trying to think about, like, what's a good framework? How can we categorize how to think about some of this stuff? And, you have idiosyncratic risks, right? These are things where anything has risk. Custodial technologies have risk. Without proper education, without people using service providers where they're needed, bad things can happen from just owning self-custodial Bitcoin. We're aware of that, and we also see that there's quite a bit of value in also participating in that. In fact, all the value is really associated with that. So those can be mitigated with service providers, and having shared custodial schemes is a way that we don't have to give up control and unilateral control by custodial providers and still receive a lot of the benefits of mitigating idiosyncratic risk. A lot of what my research focuses on is the next topic of systemic risk. And I look into like, how did banking systems emerge historically? And who are the participants within those systems? So like when you think about topics like free banking, and how are those structured and how do they naturally function in private markets? And the challenge is that we don't really have like a perfect precedent to work off of. History isn't perfect. Economic systems from the top down are incredibly complex. They're data points in a lot of ways, and we can draw some conclusions, but it's very hard for us to be certain about that. We could take a much more Austrian approach and say, from a bottom up, does this make sense to me at the unit level? And a lot of the issues that what we want to be mitigating within Bitcoin is centralization risks. Like a key criticism of Lightning is it has natural incentives to centralize over time because liquidity begets liquidity. Is that bad? Well, in isolation, yes, but it depends on how you think about what the function of a Lightning service provider is going to be. Is it going to be this vision of everybody is sending Lightning to each other peer-to-peer, or are we going to have a handful of service providers who are facilitating payments at lower denominations or at much higher transaction throughput than we've ever seen? If you look at like historical free banking systems, or pretty much any banking system that's emerged, they emerge with localized banks that optimize for trust based on their understanding of who is in a community, right? They'd be like, okay, we're going to give loans because I know this person in my community. So they can optimize for that. Those didn't scale as much. But to facilitate payments at larger scale, they had centralized clearinghouses that would net payments between all of them. There's a vision here where we could have more centralized service providers like Lightning that are scaling like a centralized service house. And then we could have something like Fedimint where you're optimizing for trust at more localized levels, acting as more like community banking functions and a variety of other functions that are somewhat novel. So the point of all this is that political capture is the major risk, the primary risk that we are here to avoid. If this system becomes politically captured, then our best case, frankly, if it becomes politically captured, our worst case scenario is digital gold. So like from the investor's perspective who doesn't care about what we're trying to produce from the world, they might view that as okay enough. But if we want to have this globally neutral unit of account type financial system for Bitcoin, it's going to take quite a bit more than that. Political capture is still very much a risk of how this system is scaling over time. And what's most important throughout this growth process is that the peer-to-peer self-custodial system achieves critical mass and continues to grow at a rapid enough rate. And it is there today, but we need to make sure that it continues to be. I think that in order for the system to serve its function as freedom money, we don't need everything to be self-custodial. In fact, that would be practically impossible when you think about how organizations would adopt it. But we do need it to be material enough to act as a deterrence mechanism for the same reason that countries have big guns so that nobody ever wants to attack them. We need to have big guns within the self-custodial peer-to-peer system. And I don't know what that number is, right? I don't know how material that actually is, but it needs to be significant enough so that any political actor knows how quickly people can exit any sort of shared or full custodial system into the peer-to-peer system that will ultimately undermine its value. And as long as it's material enough for that, we maintain unilateral exit in a lot of our protocols, then we're going to be okay. And custodial systems can still exist in some format. So going back to this theme of a lot of this doesn't need to be solved through pure technological solutions, but actually incentive alignment is a great way of doing it. There's this scheme, and you can find it on GitHub. It's linked in the research that Galoy has proposed on effectively automating bank runs within federated eCash systems. So what does that mean? Who here understands like Fedimint or? Okay, yeah. So like. Here's the primary criticism of Fedimint. It's a form of shared custody that issues this eCash token that is trusted. This eCash token could theoretically be debased. It's something that, because you get all these privacy benefits from it, it's not as auditable. So there's a trade-off between privacy and auditability that we have to deal with. And it's like if we want to optimize for a function like privacy, then we have to forego some other aspects of if we had a perfect ledger like Bitcoin that we can always be verifying. So to balance these trade-offs, we're creating pretty like novel schemes. And with Fedimint, it's one, you're optimizing for custody within your, trusted community, right? So that'd be like, if I want to set up a federation with me and my family members so that I don't just have self-custodial Bitcoin and I die in a car crash and that's donated to the network, my family still gets to hold on to it. So like, that's the most, that's one of the best examples we can have of like how we would be trusting people in a group of shared custody. So then if we're using eCash on top of that to transact, and we don't have to, you can always use Lightning, but if you want to have private bearer assets like cash in your wallet, that's what it's going to be used for. So the question is when that's being minted, is anybody going to be debased? Will they issue more eCash than you have in the Bitcoin multisig? And with the issuance of eCash, it's something that, because it's not as audible, we have to create incentives to ultimately reduce it. And I can't really get into the details at this point, but it's effectively like, Callie made this proposal. It goes back to ideas from an eCash project called Script. I think it was like in 2016 or 2017. But he's kind of formulated it in a way that really makes a lot of sense, where it probabilistically increases the risk of insolvency for pursuing any sort of fractional reserve model. It's not a perfect technological solution. We'll never be able to, in any specific instance, verify that fractional reserve or debasement was occurring at a particular mint. But on a long enough timeline, which is actually pretty short, depending on how you structure it, we can be probabilistically certain that the participants of a mint whose eCash is getting debased will eventually get caught. So what's important about that? Is it because we want them to get caught? No, we want them to never do it in the first place. And if they know that they can't pursue a long-term business model doing it, now the incentives of the system are changed. So if we implement a technology like this in all eCash mints, you're pretty much going to be relegating the idea of eCash debasement into the bucket of fraud or edge markets, which would be a small immaterial proportion, which you can never really get rid of in anything for the most part. But for the vast majority, it wouldn't be a rational business model to pursue anymore, and that's pretty compelling. Okay, I'm really running low on time, huh? Okay, so I'm going to go quick here. This is a picture of Alexander the Great cutting the Gordian knot, and for those who are familiar with this idea and those who are not, there's a group of men who are all sitting around this knot, which is representative of the idea of a very complex technical problem. And they're all trying to figure out, how do we untangle this knot? And they ask Alexander the Great on how to do it. And he comes up with a knife and he cuts the knot open. And that's the idea of incentive alignment within some of these complex technological solutions, is that we need to find creative and clever ways, just like Satoshi did, to solve for these very complex technical problems with incentive alignment in other protocols. So I think the vision of all this is, if we have this digitally native system emerge, if peer-to-peer competition is significant enough, it's going to be so much more informationally transparent. People are going to be maintaining unilateral exit from protocols such as Lightning. And because transaction efficiency is going to be so high in capital markets as well, I don't really see a possibility where we have all these functions existing and fractional reserve can emerge in the future. That's kind of one of the theories that we're still pushing, but I think that if that's the type of system, then banks effectively become service providers again. We can think about things like Lightning service providers, and I think that the concept of a Lightning service provider is eventually going to scale into a bunch of protocols. We're going to have service providers that are enabling all the protocols people are participating in, and hopefully aren't even aware of it at that point. And what does that mean? That means that political capture of the system is basically dead, and that peer-to-peer and trust minimized type systems are going to be so competitive, it's going to be practically impossible for anybody to influence the system from the outside. And perhaps elected officials can become public servants again. So as a final point, yeah. So as a final point, we need a bridge towards this system, and it's an irreducibly complex system. I actually first heard this term from Richard Dawkins in some of my more atheist readings, and it's an interesting idea where he was applying it to evolution over time, and proof of God or proof of some things in evolution is that creationists use the concept of like the eyeball. It's such a complex thing. How could we possibly have evolved to it? And similar mechanics exist in a lot of things that we have today. So here we have a mousetrap with the Federal Reserve sitting under it. And for all the pieces to be in place to ultimately crush this incumbent system, you know, we need the hammer, we need the spring, we need the catch, we need the platform, we need Bitcoin, and we need these protocols that enable this peer-to-peer type system. Bitcoin, I think, at a peer-to-peer level that is competitive enough with the incumbent system to achieve these properties is going to require a lot of pieces to move into place at the same time. And we're going to need agency in functions that are less than desirable throughout the growth period, just to bridge the gap from today to tomorrow and get to this state that's going to enable the vision that we all see. And you know, it's similar to growing. Our feet grow. Just as our feet grow and our bodies fill into that later on, we're going to be going through these awkwardness in various stages as protocols build. And but if we can keep the peer-to-peer system growing, if we can keep education high enough, if we can keep adoption pushing that direction, it's ultimately going to act as a deterrent against any sort of political capture over time. And we're going to create the first globally neutral, apolitical financial system enabling prosperity for everybody. And that's why we're all here. Thank you. On the dot.
Thank you, sir. Well done. That was great.